Well, we saw a new head coach at Alabama named Kalen DeBoer, who, after all the praise he got here last week, showed that the Nick Saban era is over. Because Nick Saban would have never lost that game, never did lose that game. And Matt, people talk about the La Monroe game in '07. That was he
Yeah.
inherited a 6-7 team that was 500. This is the worst loss I have ever seen by a quality Alabama team. I've seen bad Alabama teams lose to
Sure.
MU and to Monroe, but I've never seen a great Alabama team lose like this. And it is sending shockwaves through the Alabama ecosystem right now because for all the good that we felt a week ago, the questions that were lingering deep in the crevices of Alabama fans' minds are starting to pop up. And people are reminding us that even at Washington, you saw these very bizarre calls, and you know what I'm talking about. I think there was a game against Arizona State, was it last year? There were other games that Washington barely escaped. So yeah, there's a shock to the system, and what makes it even worse is Alabama has to play again this week against a fading South Carolina team, but it's the week after against Tennessee. And suddenly the numbers game is alive. But what you said a minute ago is true. I mean, I was in College Station yesterday, and I was being told that's the most important game of the day, and I don't even remember what I saw out there because so much has happened since then.
Now, DeBoer's got to explain how you go from the highest of highs, beating the class of the SEC in Georgia, to going to Nashville and losing to the team that's been the doormat for their existence in the conference. And that's the biggest. Paul, this isn't like they lost to Georgia and they went to Columbia and lost to South Carolina. Still stunning, maybe explainable. This one's tough because we've now seen the swing of the pendulum, the highest of highs and now the lowest of lows for Alabama football.
Yeah, and I mean there have been bigger upsets in college football history. I would
Yes.
point to Jim Harbaugh and Stanford beating a number two USC, but even Stanford at the time wasn't a great power, but it had had moments. But when you talk about college football and you mention Vanderbilt, you immediately get a laugh. I mean, it is like remember you're too young to even know, but back in the '70s and '80s, it was like, oh, you got Slippery Rock for homecoming. Now it's Vanderbilt, and even though we both know what's going on there, it's they always find a way to blow it. And so this time it didn't happen, and it just seems surreal. And it reminded me a little bit. I covered that Vanderbilt game 40 years ago when Ray Perkins was the coach, and it felt very similar. That was 2 years after Bryant, and suddenly nothing felt right at Alabama again. And I'm not saying that this morning because I know what I said last week, and everyone knows it because it's been shown a million times. But there were old line Alabama fans that just didn't quite buy it, but it was because of the collapse at the end of the second half,
Yeah.
and that
Yeah.
came back yesterday. And in Kalen DeBoer, I'm going to take you through his week. He's calm, he's cool. He came on our show Wednesday, and we went back and talked about the Georgia game. Can you imagine trying to get Nick Saban 4 days after a major win to say, Coach, I know you got Vanderbilt. Let's go back and talk.
I said it on Sunday Bloody Sunday that here's where college football is this morning. Okay. Two things. One, there's going to be the crowd that is correct about this. The 12-team playoff has made the regular season a little less meaningful. Okay, so now everyone's screaming at their watching this. Matt, what do you mean? Well, because Paul, everything that we just went over, Alabama losing to Vanderbilt, Tennessee losing to Arkansas, maybe even Missouri losing to A&M, maybe even Ole Miss losing to Kentucky a week ago. Because of the 12-team playoff, no one's really out of it yet. That's good and bad at the same time because now teams are pretty much getting a pass.
No, I think it's made it more fascinating. It's much more like chess because you have to think two or three moves ahead. And by the way, I don't play chess. I'm
I
just
was going to
guessing.
say, you strike me as a guy that plays chess.
My next career. But it is, I mean, the schedule, you have to know your team schedule because you can't just go, oh, I mean, a year ago, you lose a game like this. The only thing you can do is hope.
Yeah.
Now it's okay. Well, what does that mean? What is this? it's a little bit more like it is a lot more like the NFL where there's so many variables. And the games still matter. They just matter differently. And I like it because I mean Alabama losing to Vanderbilt a year ago, they're done. I mean,
Yes.
what chance do they have of recovering from that? Now they're okay. It's they got this game, that game, that game, and what happens over here, here, and here. And you know, and first of all, we don't even know. I mean, we think like if you're in the SEC, yeah, we'll get 4 or 5. Really? Don't be so sure about that.
I mean, that's where you are today. You're like, well, should we start looking at the Big Ten because they've got Penn State, they've got Ohio State, they've got Oregon. That's next week. I thought we'd be previewing next week more than
Yeah.
recapping this week, but this is where we are. But you're right. Now, and again, I think there's good and bad in that. There's good in that. Okay, 12 teams. You like in the NFL, you can stub your toe in the NFL a few times. Not in college football, you still can't do that. So it didn't make yesterday any less entertaining. And oh my God, but we are now in an age of the 12-team playoff where you can stub your toe and still be fine. But the overarching theme, Paul, I want people to really start considering, especially what happened at 2:30 a.m. when I'm sitting here
Oh
getting
my
over college
goodness.
football final, watching Miami and Cal, which, by the way, the officiating in that one was absolutely deplorable. That if the ACC office is not getting a call this morning, shame on them because there were some calls. I'm not saying it determined the outcome, but it had a lot to do with it. Credit Miami from coming all the way back. They survived, but it's the jumping off point for this next comment. Cal football. They're used to libraries and protests. That's who and what they are. That's who and what they've always been. Vanderbilt football, we just talked about it, the doormat of the SEC. But because of where we are in the sport, college football right in front of our eyes, the bad teams aren't awful anymore that are historically awful because Diego Pavia, a really nice
Yeah.
quarterback from New Mexico State, can transfer to Vanderbilt and make them competitive. College football now, the dominant teams aren't going to be as dominant as they were because a player like Caleb Downs can leave Alabama and go to Ohio State. A player like Quinshon Judkins will leave Ole Miss and go to Ohio State. Paul, we're seeing it right in front of our eyes. Parity is here, and I think parity is here to stay.
Yeah, I mean, Diego is a perfect example of 2024 because Vanderbilt would not have beaten Alabama normally. And listen, Matt, I mean, all the detractors are out there, and good for them. But you and I are on the front line of promoting the sport, and starting about 6 o'clock yesterday, I don't remember a 6 or 7 or 8 hour period, and you had to deal with it more than I did. That was more dramatic, and none of those games were really big games going in. I mean, even with game day. I mean, Miami Cal, it just felt like a sideshow, and I can assure you, nobody. I mean, there were probably bars all across the country going, "How do we get the FCC network to watch the end of this Vanderbilt Alabama game?" Because it was just not it was not a high priority for anyone. But here we are today. And I'll also offer just from a week to week to week. I don't ever remember anything quite like the rise and fall that we saw in 7 days with Alabama. I mean, it is breathtaking to think about the amount of goodwill and cred that Kalen DeBoer was able to literally throw away in a week's time.